welcome. I am Gloria Kondrup, and I am the Executive Director of the HMCT, Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography here at ArtCenter. And we had a wonderful experiment this semester. This term is a collaborative exhibition between the HMCT and ArtCenter ArtCenter exhibitions. Redact, Rewrite, and Reframe. It's Art in the News. And this is our second panel, our artist panel, where 4 artists who participated in the exhibition currently at South Campus Gallery and at the 870 building, Chang, Steve Hurd, and Samira Yamin, sorry, Samira, and I actually asked how to pronounce her name, and Yimema Wyman. She's not here today, but Julie will talk about it. I'm going to turn this over to Julie Joyce, who is our Director of ArtCenter Galleries. She will lead you through the discussion and introduce our artists to you. So Julie, I'm disappearing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gloria. And also thanks to the entire team at HMCT for hosting this panel and for working with us in exhibitions to make the exhibition possible. If you are just joining, just to reiterate, this is the panel discussion, a panel discussion featuring 3 artists in Redact, Rewrite, Reframe. And this is an exhibition on view through September at ArtCenter College of Design's HMCT Gallery and Hutto Patterson Gallery. Redact, Rewrite, Reframe presents work by a selection of artists and designers utilizing images and materials from news media in distinctive ways with an emphasis on global sociopolitical events from the past 2 decades. The exhibition takes into account the ongoing debates about the subjectivity of the news and is a timely opportunity to explore our current moment of increasingly divided public and viewpoints. And the artists and designers presented in the exhibition use various media that's informed by graphic design, typography, collage, painting, and photography, all examining the constructed and ideological nature of the news. Before we officially begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that ArtCenter College of Design occupies the unceded ancestral and traditional land of the Hahamunga Tongva people, stewards of the San Gabriel Valley area around present-day Pasadena. And I wanted to start off in thanking the artists again, or besides what Gloria said already, featured in today's panel. We're really happy that you could be here today and provide some insight, invaluable insight into the works in the exhibition. I will begin by introducing them, and I've asked them each to speak about their works in the exhibition while also explaining how the works in the exhibition represent or relate to their larger bodies of work or their individual practices. And after that, I may have another question or two, so I might use my power of the sword or the button to do that. But otherwise, if you have a question, please direct it to the chat, and one of us will try to, either I or one of the panelists will try to address your questions. Our first, the artist who will speak first today will be Chang. And York is a Los Angeles-based artist. He received his BA and completed other postgraduate degrees and studies at UCLA. In fact, I believe that all of our panelists are graduates in some way, shape, or form of UCLA. That was sort of a happy coincidence. York has had numerous solo exhibitions, including installations in recent years at Vincent Price Art Museum and the Orange County Museum of Art. Chang creates, and I'm reading a little bit here, so forgive me, creates conceptually driven work investigating the shifting relationships between languages and images. and how our sense of truth, fiction, and reality are manipulated by the velocity of fractured narratives in evolving forms of propaganda. He works in various media and employs many different strategies, including appropriation, décollage, and performance as interventions into documentary modes of display, public address, broadcast, and reception. The next artist to speak today is Steve Hurd. I've known Steve the longest, I think. I won't even, back in the Cal State LA days, many, many years ago, but probably even before that. Steve received his BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and his MFA from UCLA. He's had numerous solo exhibitions at venues including Jack Tilton Gallery and Rosamund Felsen Gallery, as well as at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. He is also the recipient of a Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Fellowship. Hurd's paintings translate images gleaned from various forms of media, paying particular attention to how meaning is constructed. An example of some of his best known work in this regard are his paintings featuring Women's Day magazine covers. By translating such source material into painting, Hurd lends new gravity to cultural tropes and politicized moments that might otherwise remain unexamined. The next and final person to speak today is artist Samira Yamin, who received degrees in studio art and sociology from UCLA, and then went and received her MFA in studio art from UC Irvine. Her work has been the focus of solo exhibitions in recent years at Patron Gallery and at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, among others. Yamin employs war photography as her medium, often repurposing the pages of Time magazine. She's become known for her series of works that challenge and criticize the narrow perspectives on the Middle East, and more specifically Syria, in American news media. Just another word of thanks and also welcome. And I will hand the presentation over to the artist. So our first artist featured who will speak is York Chang. So I will hand this over to York.
Great, thanks, Julie. And before I begin, I just want to thank you and Gloria Condrup for including me in this context and this conversation about art in the news. I'm very grateful to be surrounded by so many accomplished and interesting designers and fellow artists. I've been working with and around newspapers for quite some time, and sometimes I question whether I've exhausted this line of inquiry, but when I see so many different and rich perspectives in the show, I can see there's much more to say. I thought I'd just start with sort of a little bit of an overview of my practice and how newspaper and news media sort of fits within that practice, and then sort of start to talk about the specific works that are in the show. I think of my art practice as an investigation into the poetics of epistemology, or the study of how we understand things to be true versus fictional, and how we develop our sense of reality from knowledge, images, and narratives. So in that sense, newspapers for me are not just a material, but also a subject and a historical site of a particular kind of epistemic reality that is on the verge of obsolescence. It's a reality in which there used to be much more of an informal shared agreement amongst a larger public on what is authoritative or accurate or truthful accounts of events in the world. And there's also a way in which newspapers serve as a kind of slowed down, decelerated analog for how images and information circulate in the public sphere now. most of the public consume information now primarily digitally through our phone screens, and there's a consumption of a kind of torrent of thousands of images each day that wash over our eyes and our minds. And this torrent's driven by an algorithm that's calibrated to push images that either please or provoke us. But there's really no friction and no real material sense of how much we're consuming. And so I believe that we barely register these images and information consciously anymore, but we're really just reacting to things on a subliminal level. And so newspapers, they had their own algorithm, and they're driven by, I think, a similar calculus of kind of a spectacle journalism that's meant to increase time spent consuming the images and news. But for newspapers, it's all kind of slowed down, and it has a sort of material dimension to them. And I'm interested in how an obsolete form of information like this can tell us something about the problem of information now. And so some of the works in the show are kind of further explorations of these kinds of themes and ideas and views of the news. So the first set of works that are shown here in the slides, these are 3 separate pieces, and it's not a triptych, but they're shown here in side by side, and they're made up of folded newsprint on marble. They're mounted on a Carrara marble that I sourced, and I was really interested in the different materials held up next to each other in contrast, which for me, these materials work on and register different timescales. I heard before someone say to me that newspapers are called the first draft of history, but they're paradoxically printed on this sort of high acidic paper that falls apart within hours of exposure to the sun. And also the information that's published within newspapers can lose their immediate relevance within weeks of publication. And on the other hand, in the cultural context, marble is usually associated with classical sculpture and antiquities. And as a stone, it's working on a geological time scale. But what's interesting is the material is actually quite porous and malleable. And so in that way, has both a contrasting and a similar relationship to the paper that's mounted on it as well. So these are images taken from newspapers that have been folded up to hide as much as it's revealing about the images. And the folding of the paper is something that's significant to me to mention. It relates to how, for me, how information systems are shaped and organized on a structural level to only show fragments of a larger picture while hiding other parts of the image that may have just as relevant information. So it's sort of, in many ways, kind of a hide and seek game, a way of trying to extrapolate from bits of information, some larger narrative that might be hidden away within a certain structure. And so the folds, to me, reference that, but they also reference ways in which information is distributed and circulated. You see newspapers and the way that they're folded up and transported and delivered to you. All of those things I like to play with in these particular series. And the title of the series is Shrouds, which I sort of use to reference a kind of elegiac kind of position in relation to the newspaper and its obsolescence, as well as, I guess, in a way, the sort of obsolescence of a kind of way in which we approached ideas of truth and authority in information as well. And so, and I think the marble also plays a sort of part in eulogizing, I think, this whole other paradigm of how we consumed information before. And I think that we can move to the next set of works. These are 3 additional pieces that are installed in this show. And I call this series of works glyphs. And the title of the series references a pictographic system of language like Egyptian hieroglyphics or Japanese or Chinese pictographic language systems. Particularly the sort of verticality of the pieces, I think, references the sort of Japanese and Chinese calligraphic traditions in art and poetry. And so these glyphs are hand-drawn, hand-painted fragments of letter forms taken from newspapers to create a kind of formal representation of how people can speak the same language but not comprehend each other, which I think is sort of a condition of our times in more exacerbated, strident sort of ways. There's a certain font that I looked to when I was hand drawing these. And there's certain fonts that have in newspapers over time taken on the look and feel of factuality. A connotation of truth starts to emerge from these curves and these particular shapes, these serif shapes. And it makes them useful, I think, to talk about and represent breakdowns in social communications. Language, in my view, has become increasingly more and more a vehicle of symbolism, particularly in the political realm, when a word is vacated of its original intent and meaning and sort of infused with something more dogmatic, something that is calculated to simply incite or agitate, rather than to connect complex discursive functions. So I'm really interested with these pieces in placing the viewer back into a space between legibility and illegibility, between knowing and not knowing. And I think in that space, you become more aware of the sort of social construction of language and its meaning as well. And so in both the glyphs and the shrouds, I'm investigating the ways in which this work also dovetails with my own exploration of my identity as an Asian American artist. The glyphs and the shrouds are really formal nods to Japanese and Chinese cultural histories that include folding practices and these sort of calligraphic arts where, you know, words and poetry and gesture all kind of come together to comment about a contemporary moment. And so I hope that the work in the show operates in that way. And I hope that folks get a chance to come out and see the works in person.
Thank you so much, York. Okay, so Steve Hurd.
Thanks, Julie. I liked your introduction, the way you described my work. That was, I think, better than I can do. But hopefully you can send me a copy of that so I can use it. I've just tried to write down a few things about this. You know, I was thinking about this. Well, first of all, this image right here is Bush with Jaime Karzai, I should have written down the names here. And well, basically 2 warring, oh gosh, it's so long ago. Anyways, I like the way when you digitize this image, it kind of became like a religious icon. And Bush, W. Bush has almost a little halo around him. Okay, and this was a series of Bush smiling. What I liked is I would get the images off the internet and I would blow them up and they would be quite distorted. And rather than try to depict the image of the mouth or any of that, I was just trying to get the distortion of the image and see how that translates once you make a painting out of it. So there's something in all of this work that has to do with the digitalizing, the mechanicalness of something on the internet or being digitized and then translating that back into painting. And I kind of feel like there's this mechanical thing that then is humanized by the activity and the performance of making a painting. What I want to say about this, I was thinking about it in a more general way about protest and kind of the issue that you're bringing up in this show. And I think like art is this voice, it's kind of quiet. And at the time when I did these, I was kind of protesting alone in the studio and making these paintings. And it was kind of a meditation because it takes kind of a long time to do each little, you know, I have to do each square inch of the painting and then try to get it all to work together. And it felt like it was kind of a prayer or a meditation or a hope to regain balance out of this whole dysfunctional thing that was going on with the war. And we showed them, and then rather than getting a regular art review, I got like a human interest review. And the writer that wrote for the LA Times, oh gosh, I can't remember her name, but it became like she used the paintings to discuss the war. And at the time, there were a lot of protests going on. And I thought, geez, you know, I go in there and I'm just a person with a sign. I mean, I don't want to discourage anybody from protesting. And the whole body of everybody doing that is quite powerful. But the idea of making something and then somebody seeing it and writing about it and it going out there, it became kind of a different voice, a louder voice. And I felt really a lot that I was able to do more as a protest, making this work rather than if I was just a face in the crowd, kind of, not to put that down, but there was just some kind of interesting power that was kind of unexpected that art can do. And I think that's what's really interesting when you get that kind of attention. It's always nice to get attention as an artist, but when it's an issue that you care about and somebody uses your work to say something, I mean, Julie, even when you were saying this stuff, it was like, wow, I really like her perspective on this. And you know, it's always surprising that you put something out there and people have a way of looking at it and interpreting it themselves and coming up with something that you didn't necessarily, you weren't able to really verbalize other than making the work, which implies that. And I really like that. And I like that about the show, that all the artists are kind of doing something about it and in a suggestive, poetic way, rather than directly saying, you know, we hate Trump or something, you know, which I just said. Okay, there it all is. If you haven't seen the show, I was very pleased to see that I got a whole wall. Thank you. And I think that this body of work, it's interesting just to see it after so many years. So why don't I just talk about the work? It was those images of the flag draped coffins came out in 2004, and it was kind of a mistake. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. They were trying to suppress these images, but they were actually kind of beautiful and nice because they didn't want to remind people that soldiers were dying. I like this mechanical, and when I was downloading them, they became digitized for a second. And I went, whoa. And I've said, I want to, I want to investigate that. And it kind of makes it like pointillism, like there's the history of that kind of digitized stuff before there was digitized. And I like the fact that it kind of refers to this older, like impressionism and pointillism, but also that the military is a mechanical kind of thing. And the digitization is also mechanical. And like I said before, by painting these things, it kind of brings in the human element. And it feels like this whole thing is out of balance. And by making the work, I'm creating balance. You said to kind of tie it in, but I think you did a good job. But yeah, I have done, I like to do appropriation work. I like to work from found images. Advertising has been really great to do because, well, first of all, I don't like creating my own composition. I mean, I love that people do that, but or colors and all this other stuff. I like when I find something and that by translating it into paint, it really does change it a lot. Like it's an interpretation of something I'm seeing. It isn't really different in a way than painting a landscape or a still life. It's just that it's advertisement. It's flat artwork that I'm recreating. I found that in doing advertising, and especially these Women's Day paintings, I have one behind me. They use a lot of desire and fear in selling you something. And I think that kind of ends up reflecting how the advertisers and maybe even how we think about ourselves, because they want success. And what's similar that art has with advertising is that I'm looking for a customer. I'm trying to grab your attention. I would like you to not necessarily purchase my work, although that would be nice, but to buy the idea or by thinking about it, engaging in the work, and that's what advertising has. And so all those kinds of marketing things come into play. We don't have the work here, but I actually went into these ads that they used to put in papers for I don't know, sex workers, I guess, saying, I'll do this and that. And it was funny because when I painted them, it was kind of just for the shock value. But then I realized that the things they were saying was very similar in a sensual way to what painting can be. So when I paint these things, they become sensual and physical and human. And they're dysfunctional things that then become balanced. They're still dysfunctional, but by making art, it's almost like an exorcism, and I feel that's how I feel about it, and they become balanced. Thank you.
Okay, Stephen, thank you so much. So Samira, you are up next.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. And thank you to everyone. And again, I'm going to just echo what's already been said here, but I just really appreciate the opportunity to think about the work in the context of other works that are dealing with similar questions. And an interesting thread that I'm seeing between the works, just in hearing Steve and York talk, speak about it as the relationship of content to materiality. And that's actually a really important part of the work. And I think, as York mentioned, the materiality of news media is itself part of the content. It tells us about how to engage the material, how to engage the subject matter, the images are newsworthy. We've, media outlets have decided that these subjects are newsworthy, so to speak, but that they're, represented in what we would call a throwaway economy when it's in the, physical material, and digitally it's, in the digital medium, it's even faster, actually. There's like a way that the digital medium both preserves and makes obsolete in this like really fascinating, immediate way. There's a different fragility to the medium in the digital realm, even though it feels, I think, because we can save it somewhere and it stays the same, it feels like it's a little bit more stable. But I do think that the digital realm is itself this kind of, you can disappear something with the stroke of a key. So I do think this question of materiality, I think, is probably one of the really significant through lines, and what that materiality suggests about the way that media is constructed and how it's consumed. And that's, I think on that point, I'll use that to lead into my work, which is largely, I started using and collecting representations of, it started with, so Steve, I recognize some of those images very deeply because I have them in my personal sort of archives that I collected starting in 2001. Eventually by about 2009, I decided to start using Time magazine exclusively in my work, even though I'd been collecting images from different, I should say, physical media sources, and watching them age and collecting them and organize folder, things like that. And at a certain point, I decided to just work exclusively with Time magazine so that I could see how one news source was constructing narratives by itself. So I think of it sort of in a scientific method way, where you just kind of sweep away some variables so that you can see how things are shifting and changing within a few, I guess, variables or details or subject matter, or whatever it is. So yeah, so I think that largely the work has historically been a investigation, but really an interrogation and a critique of the nature of media as a construction, and this relationship between truth-telling, facts, and information. And so whether the subject matter, the content is factual or not, is less the question in my mind, especially since it deals very directly with photography. But this idea of what other information can we glean from looking and reading? What can we know about the way that a thing is made and how it's intended to be received, things like that. And so I've done, the work has largely, before this body of work especially, been a almost structuralist with a capital S, pursuit, set up a series of, what's the word I'm looking for? Procedures, and then follow them through and see what happens. And the goal was to bring out and to reveal or extricate these sort of underlying systems of representation. I have no idea how long I've been talking. Julie, will you just stop me when I've gone on too long? Meant to turn on a timer for myself. But after several years of working in this way of thinking about, the nature of media as a construction, and just thinking to how can we critique the subject matter based on knowing that it's structurally a construction, I started to I got to a point where I started to ask the question of essentially, now what? If we acknowledge and accept for granted the fact that media is a construction, what do we do with that knowledge as viewers, as readers? And I couldn't, the answer wasn't to not look. It was definitely one of the possible options, but it wasn't right. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel right. And so then the question becomes, for me personally, how to look. And that's where this body of work comes into play. So this is the way these works are made, are carved glass. So it's about 3/4 inch thick borosilicate glass. And the lines that you see here are carved directly into the glass, and then the images from Time magazine, in this case it's a 2-page image, are mounted to the back. And what happens is you get a refracted view of the image. So in this case, in the past, in the work, I cut patterns in, and so pieces of the image would fall away. For this body of work, I thought, since it's really about viewership, I wanted to leave everything there, but to create the conditions in which the active viewership and the active readership and engagement with the images would be somehow intervened upon in a way that would allow for a kind of reader or viewer guided choreography and relationship with the images. And so what ends up happening is you approach the work, and things are refracted, but the images are there behind the glass. And so if you move and you kind of lean in and tilt your head and get low and all this, you can access different parts of the image. It can never be taken in as the sort of gestalt, the way that, you know, news kind of comes at us from the page, and you're turning the page and the body stays static and the page turns. In this case, the thing to be there, and that the movement, I mean, that the dynamism was embodied in the act of viewership. And so I could talk more about the way that the lines come from a system of organizing or constructing two-dimensional space with that's called symmetry. I could talk more about that later, but I think for the purposes of our conversation, I think this idea that of viewer engagement and kind of creating a new mode of readership and engagement with the media, with images, with representation at large, and just the act of readership and consumption of all things, whether it's Women's Day or a newspaper or Time magazine, and the arts, you know, anything that we're consuming as readers and viewers, as members of society, that there's a critical relationship. And I don't mean that in a sort of so negative way, but just that there's that viewership is an engaged and hopefully critically embodied activity. We're not recipients. I think that this problem of what we call, you know, fake news, it's a possibility that news that is a total fabrication proliferate throughout the culture because we're not reading with a sense of credibility. If we were reading and engaging our surroundings with a question mark over everything, and a curiosity over everything, then we would be a lot slower to consume. It would interrupt the creation of information in the way that maybe would make it a little more difficult for so-called fake things to kind of find their way around. And it's that question mark, it's the process of engagement, I think, that makes us vulnerable to the types of information that we consume, internalize, and then participate in spreading. And so what I want to do with the work at this stage is going back to what in terms of this kind of private act in the studio, I do think very much about this idea of a private relationship, nurturing a private engagement and relationship to images, and trying things, creating the circumstances, creating the conditions in which a critical engagement could flourish, actually, and then making objects in that process. This is really just me making weird ways of engaging the images myself, and then sort of sharing it with the world, and saying, you know, what else can be read here beyond the simple content? What else can be internalized beyond just the images themselves that we take as facts and as information? And in that process, can we actually deepen our relationship to the individual subjects, the lives that are at stake in these representations, rather than taking them as these kind of moments that then pass at the turn of a page? So can we stand here a little bit longer? Can we actually find it in ourselves to drive a embodied relationship to the images, to the individuals? What happens when we slow that down? And how can we take that into other experiences in our daily lives? And, you know, at the very least, into the next time you pick up a Time magazine at your dentist's office, what's your relationship to the images in that magazine? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you, York. Thank you, Steve. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I just wrote down a few questions that I thought I'd direct to the individual artists. And then I would also encourage the artists, because I find them much 100% more fascinating and interesting than myself. If any of the artists would like to ask questions of each other, I'd be interested in hearing the questions and the responses. In the meantime, I thought I'd ask you, York, one of the things about this Shroud series that I find so interesting, and you did such an amazing job about talking about the conceptual properties and the poetic properties that drove you to sort of conceive of and realize these pieces. But what fascinates me also are their physical properties. The juxtaposition of the particular juxtaposition of materials you talked about on a conceptual level, but I wonder if you could also just say a word about the what formally you thought of, what sort of led you to these in a more formal way.
Yeah, thanks. I think that, I mean, I had been storing these, I mean, I've been working with folded newspaper images for some time, where I really started folding them thinking about grids. You know, early forensic photography was all about overlaying a grid over an image. And there was a belief at that time, I think in the turn of the 19th century, where there's the advent of forensic photography, where they really kind of believed that if you put a grid over it and you examined it more closely, that there were truths that could be discerned from that. And so actually, I think that that's an interesting connection to what Samira was talking about in terms of overlaying her images with the borosilicate glass with these sort of patterns on them, as well as a way of activating the viewer in some way. And so, you know, I was doing that through folding images and creating a grid on top of the images through the folds. And as I was doing that, all of these folded newspaper images, I just started to notice that there's something really interesting about the way that they're all folded. There's something sensual about the way that they're folded. And there's something mysterious about, the things that are hidden when they're folded as well. And so, yeah, I was really looking at them and also thinking about how do they also have something to push off of, and there was something about having that contrast of, something as seemingly permanent and as solid as granite or marble that could serve as a base, but also as sort of like, the other side of a spectrum that would allow people to sort of have a sense of the space between them. And that's what kind of brought these two kinds of materials kind of together. And with the folds, I think that there's something I wanted to sort of play with the marble, where I could sort of inscribe and carve into the marble as well, references to the sort of formal folds as well, especially in the piece in the middle. You can kind of see where these kind of carvings occurred. So yeah, that's what I can say about the sort of formal properties of these pieces. So
Yes, and Susan Malmstrom also asks about this work in the chat. Is the lux value of the marble also meant to contrast with the newsprint or elevate it, or both? Yeah, maybe you already answered that, but I just thought I'd reiterate that. And thanks, Susan. We were obviously on the same thought pattern there.
yeah, I feel like there is an elevation, but there's also, the part that I really wanted to kind of bring into it was this eulogizing kind of quality. I think when I first started making these, I was really kind of feeling very exhausted from images, and just the torrent of images kind of constantly coming at us. And so the initial shrouds that I made actually completely hid the image and reversed the image so that it became basically a latent image where none was visible except through the sort of backside of the paper. And slowly they've been kind of little pieces of the images started to sort of still peek out and come out. And I thought that complicated things a little bit further. But yeah, I think that the marble is really intended to sort of be a counterpoint with some interesting intersections, at key points. So
Great. Thanks so much. I know we only have so much time left, and I thought I had a question for Steve also. Steve, thanks for your discussion about these. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I just wanted to say how affected I was by this work, because I think the using this image alone, this was sort of an image, and I can't recall where it first broke. But it was such a big deal when it did break, because like you said, it was an image that finally brought home to the American public what the effects of war, contemporary warfare actually do, on a national level, because, our wars are fought elsewhere, of course. So this was what these are the images of the coffins coming off the plane that were the first, I think, for a lot of people to hit them over the head and realize kind of the seriousness and the gravity and the horror of what was happening during this time. But I also appreciated your discussion of the digitization of this imagery. And it's not a particularly huge question or weighty or anything, but I know that, knowing your bodies of work, you also have done digitized versions of Abstraction. And I can't recall, was this the first series where you digitized images, or was it, or had you done it before?
I don't know. They were kind of being done simultaneously. The digitized things were called outbursts, and they were scribbles I was doing after 9/11, where I was just basically in such a funk. I was smoking a lot of weed and drinking a lot of beer and watching the news and going down the rabbit hole and just scribbling, making these scribbles. And I was like, and then I probably did these, and then I thought, you know, I'm going to digitize them. And it was actually a layering where it was this emotional thing, then made mechanical, and then brought back to this, what I feel is humanizing the digitized image. Yeah, that was a bad, it actually all culminated me in having a stroke. And so that was, it wasn't a good way to deal with things, but making the work, like I said, I mean, there's a therapeutic element to it, but it's also kind of, I feel like I'm doing what I can do on my own to kind of, like I said, to kind of bring in balance or some kind of thought or some kind of consciousness to what's happening. But those were kind of related to, like I'm saying, an emotional outburst of to what was going on. You know, it's interesting because those are the only thing I haven't appropriated, but by digitizing them, I could then appropriate them again. So, you know, because it's weird. I went through art school trying to be creative and actually bumped into this guy, Mike Bidlow, who, you know, the artist Mike Bidlow, who came to UCLA and lectured. And for those of you who don't know who he is he copies like all the famous artworks. And he makes like, he made Picasso's Guinevere, I'm probably saying it wrong, you know, giant paintings and Pollock's and everything. And they look exactly like them. And they're called not Picasso, not, you know, not Pollock. And he showed these, and everybody has evolved to the point where not, you know, everything in art is acceptable now. But this guy copying these paintings like blew their minds. And that was really interesting to me. And he was saying this thing to them that really upset them, which was, he said, you get all the things that you get with the original, but in my work, you get that new thing, that conceptual thing. And it was hilarious, actually, you know, and it was like, he never explained really, you know, it was this second thought, this reflection on something you know about. And I realized at that point that I don't need to make up, you know, and Borofsky and Jonathan Borofsky was around, and there was all this kind of very, you know, using your imagination, you know, things. And there was something about talking about what was relevant and what was going on, that at least in advertisement at that time. And then these things came about. You know, I want to say something about Samira mentioning the glass and the blur. I don't know if that was the word, but I thought, wow, all of us, all three of us, York too, there's a blur in the work, which slows down the viewer. And I really like that idea that with art, and you just have to be a patient person. I mean, you know, there are a lot of people, they don't pay attention, but for those who care to understand something, to slow them down, to make it a little complicated, to make it so they have to look through that blurry glass or look at the folds or the way that your text was all kind of jumbled up, you know, to sit there and think about it, you know. That's what I think I'm really interested in this work in particular. In my other work, I do it more with drips and just painting it, not trying to paint it really well, you know, but the quality is something else, like in the color or the edges of things, you know, not whether they're exact or not. Anyways, maybe I went on a little bit about that.
Thank you, Steve. Those are all really great points. And I know we're out of time, but I would like to ask Samira one question before we wrap it up. Well, actually, there's a lot going on in the chat. one of the questions my colleague Christina Valentine asks are about what draws you to the images that you choose to work with. And also there are some other things going on in the chat, and knowing how well-spoken you all are, but you particularly, Samira, if you could maybe speak to all of that in the next minute, and then we can wrap it up. Sorry.
I have never said anything in a minute in my entire life.
Okay, a few minutes.
Don't give me a soapbox. Yeah, I think I'm just going to reread Christina's question here. Thank you, Christina, for it. The process in terms of, to speak to the process of selecting, let's see, what is your selection process? Yeah, in terms of images. So my work historically has been about a so-called Middle East, and this, it's not a geographic location, but a political one that is very nebulous and shifts and moves and changes according to the conversation and the point of the invoking of this political space of the Middle East. So at times it includes South Asia, sometimes it includes North Africa, and so it's but what it is it's this sort of foil for the West in many ways. Historically speaking, Edward Said writes very much about this in Orientalism, and this idea that we use the other, in this case, the Middle East, the so-called Orient, to orient ourselves as in the West, so that when we essentially, if you represent the other as savage, if you represent the other as pitiful, that really what it is, the endeavor is actually to define and represent oneself as the opposite. So they are savage. That's what savages look like, and we don't look like that. So therefore, we must be civilized. That's what pitiful lives look like. We don't look like that. Therefore, we must be honorable. I don't know what the opposite of pitiful is, actually. Coming from that understanding and that position, I'm looking at images of the Middle East and asking myself, what is the construction here? I see a relationship to the Orientalist painting movement, the Orientalism of the 18th and 19th centuries. Again, in a short time, it's hard to kind of expand on that. But what I'm curious about, and with this body of work, I'm looking specifically at images of Syria, but what really I'm thinking about in the bigger sense is this idea that certain parts of the world are only ever represented or articulated through specific lenses and specific narratives. So the Middle East is a place of turmoil, of warfare, of horror, terror, these things, and those are the conditions under which the Middle East is deemed or seen to be as newsworthy. And what ends up happening is when you only send your photographers and your journalists to a location at times of war, it appears that that place is a place of exclusively war. And the dangers in that, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that when a bomb goes off in Paris, it violates our notion of what Paris is, Paris being a city of love and this kind of romance and fashion and whatever, and a bomb going off violates and undermines that image. Because we have so much other Paris, we don't have anything of Baghdad or like Damascus or wherever other than the representations of either international, civil, or proxy wars. So when a bomb goes off in Baghdad, it's just another day in Baghdad. It's only newsworthy when it's part of this large structure. You know, it's like, it's just another day. And that allows wars to be fought endlessly. because it's not seen as violating the place or the image of the place in our minds. It would be unconscionable if the US wanted to go to war with any nation in Europe at this point, right? Just honestly unconscionable, because there is no, that the idea of warfare in Europe is a dated one, and it's seen as this historical violation of a different sort. So anyway, I'll just end it there. Thank you all for sticking around past time, but yeah, a lot to talk about. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, York, and Samira. Wonderful. And again, I'm going to go relook at your work in the exhibition now with a whole new perspective. I really do appreciate that. You know, it's so much wonderful work to look at. So again, thank you. And thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank
Everyone.
you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.